Larry Goldberg had a big birthday this weekend, and that has gotten a little bit in the way of our ability to put this show on earlier. But he managed to squeeze out some time for us tonight. Larry, glad to have you on board.
Great to be here.
All right, we've got the ARK Invest monthly summary. Cathie Wood and her crew put this together once a month. Many of you are waiting for this with the same enthusiasm that we are each month. Larry, talk to me. Do you think people need to go see the Cathie Wood original as well as watch us, or is this
Yeah,
enough?
particularly this week. I mean, we're talking about a really major event happening in this war, and we're going through a real change in economic conditions. So I think while we capture the essence of what she's talking about, I think for the real color and value, and today's going to be a little short show. We're going to be a little bit constrained in time. We're going to go through it very quickly, and I highly recommend people watch Cathie in the Know, for real.
Okay,
But we'll hope to give you the distillation of what she tells us in this little show today.
right.
With,
Okay.
with Right. So, I mean, the key themes are oil prices and Middle East reshaping, obviously. AI's convergence era, obviously. There is a wobble in the marketplace right now, and it's called private credit risk. And our viewers really need to know about this and what it means and how serious it is. We're going to talk about productivity and jobs transformation because there's some squirrely and crazy news coming out job about jobs, and we'll talk about that. That's probably the most interesting part of today. And then the fiscal deficit and the yield curve, and then market indicators and outlook. Sounds good?
Yep, it's good.
Let's get into it. So this is kind of the executive summary. If you don't have time and you don't have patience, or you don't have, the interest, I would say these are the important points.
So
That in the macro,
people could
sorry,
screenshot this and look at it
yeah,
later. Huh?
yeah, yeah. So a couple of things. Oil price, the macro environment, oil prices were collapsing.
Right.
Of course, they're not now because of the war. It's a very temporary thing. I don't think that's going to change. That's going to change the long-term direction of the oil price collapse.
And
Fed is
important,
still high. Yeah.
and a quick note, Larry, the first tanker went through the Straits of Hormuz earlier today without incident. So we may be past this problem.
Right. And the question is, was it a Chinese tanker? There are a lot of questions about it. We'll see how we do. I do believe that we will see prices go higher before we see them go lower. I think they'll get into the 90, they may touch $100 actually. And then we'll see them collapse as this war comes to, a dribbling end. It'll dribble to the end. Fed is still tight, and we still see rate cuts ahead. The deficit is improving. We could see the fiscal gap shrink faster than possible. Consumer confidence is just not there yet, despite easing inflation, tariff uncertainty weighs, and definitely there's war weighs. Cathie didn't mention that, but I think it's very clear.
Mhm.
Innovation themes, nothing's changed. AI all at once. We're seeing the change that AI is bringing coming very rapidly now. And I think we're just at the beginning of the game. This is not what Cathie says, but that's what I believe. We're seeing a surge in US productivity again versus Europe and Japan. The gap is widening. The US advantage is improving. Fewer jobs, bigger upside. We're going to see a lot of jobs lost before a lot of jobs are gained. We're going to see job gains in due course, but that's a 4 to 5 year process. The job losses are going to be a 6 to 12 month process, a 6 to 18 month process.
And this will
So we're
be
going to see
Kathy.
this.
Yes, right. Go ahead.
Yeah, we're going to see a rise in unemployment before we see a drop in
And
unemployment.
this will be Cathie's opinion. I don't know if it's yours, it isn't mine, but just to say that out loud, I think it's going to be much less pronounced than that.
I don't think you're right. I think we're going to see a lot of job gains in manufacturing, but we will see more jobs lost in services before the job gains in manufacturing overtake it. Remember, manufacturing takes a year or two to gear up. Job losses come very quickly in the services industries as people rethink their organization structure.
But just a quick note on that, Larry. I did some research today. 46% of the economy and the jobs are still in small business.
Mm.
89% of new hires are still coming in small business. So we look at the macro, we look at the big businesses and we say, oh, this is what the big guys are doing. But the small guys, it's going to take a lot longer for this to
Well,
put the challenges on these little
y-
small guys.
yeah, small business is more resilient to service company losses, large service company losses. But I retain my view. I think we're going to see more losses before we see more gains. Green shoots, housing starts rising. That's the, really good stuff going on. Home inventory improving, rolling recovery emerging. And I think the good news is that the Federal Reserve is going to have to drop the interest rates because I think even they are going to understand the necessity. Um, Credit healthy, even though we have a real crisis in you know, some of these credit, some of these companies with the low interest, high risk loans or low interest, high risk, yeah, lower interest than they should have, high risk
Right.
loans and leverage loans. I think we're going to see in general that credit is healthy. So there'll be some bankruptcies, but nothing in the large scale, classic lending environment.
Mhm.
And Cathie believes the Bitcoin thesis is intact. So Bitcoin to the gold ratio is above prior lows despite recent pressures. And the Bloomberg Commodity Index is beginning to rise, potential margin squeeze if consumer prices stay low. Margin squeeze, of course, on manufacturers.
Right, right.
So, how cheaper oil could reshape the Middle East? And it's so strange to talk about this in the time when oil is
Right,
spurting through the roof.
right.
But, Cathie, she sees EV adoption structurally destroying long-term oil demand. I think that solar power is actually more important than that
Yep.
in terms of actual squeeze on global oil.
Mhm.
Middle East is going to be forced to diversify, that we already know. And there's a deflationary tailwind. Cheap oil reduces energy costs across the economy. I think we're going to see energy costs deflate very dramatically in the coming 7 years, but I think it's going to become more expensive before it comes cheaper. So I think, as always, Cathie's looking at the longer term. We have to consider the short term.
Yeah.
OPEC Plus is losing leverage. Production cuts cannot fully offset structural demand destruction from clean energy. Well, with oil not actually flowing right now out of the Gulf, I think there's going to be a short-term crisis, and I think that we're overlooking that short-term crisis. But innovation beneficiary will arise when we get lower energy costs. But for a while, we're going to see gasoline in this country, really spurred up. So this is one area where I don't necessarily agree. I
Are
think
you talking about in the 2 to 3 week? Or are you talking about 2 to 3 months from now?
2 to 3 months
Oh,
for the next 2 to 3 months.
okay. All right. Okay.
It's going to take a while.
I tend to think that gasoline, of course, gasoline and oil are both worldwide traded commodities. And once the pressure is off from Iran, or even when it looks like it's almost off, I think they'll start bidding it down. And so this is not something we have to wait for the oil to flow. It has to be the belief that it's going to flow.
Yeah, but how long do you think it's going to take before we reach that point? You
I
think it's
think
going to happen tomorrow? I think it's going to take several months to get there.
yeah, yeah. So, okay, we'll see what happens.
Okay. So, this is the one area that I do believe with Cathie, this whole idea of all at once, that it's been a long time in coming, AI, but it's going to be dramatic in terms of what happened. So Cathie's talking about multiple things happening at the same time: AI, robotics, energy storage, genomics, and blockchain all happening at the same time.
Mhm.
I happen to have a less of a confidence in blockchain than she does, but we see AI as a massive decelerant and a deflationary force, and it's going to be very sudden, and it's happening. And so, what we're doing is we're not measuring it right now. We're not measuring the right things. This happened as well in the 90s, in the 2000s. People talked about the end of the American dream, the American, everything was coming to an end, the world was over. And I kept saying, we're measuring the wrong stuff, guys. We're measuring our exports in tonnage. We're not measuring it in terms of value. We're not measuring services. And so I think I was right then. Now I think Cathie's right then. I was right then, and I think Cathie's right now, and I'm aligned with her. So
Yeah,
yeah,
I'm aligned as well. Productivity is such an important engine, and I think what we're seeing is productivity. I'm surprised she didn't mention this because I think it's in her wheelhouse. We're seeing productivity increase from multiple directions. And so we have the people that are being laid off were that extra force, that extra number of people that were being held on these corporate payrolls because they were
yeah,
afraid of shortages. Those are the people that are being laid off right now, based on my research with Grok. And we're not really seeing layoffs in the core population of the workers. It's in this extra group. Um,
right.
and so that really increases productivity when you have those people leaving. And if you're not hiring and training, that also increases productivity.
I'll tell you, there's another area we don't measure productivity, and that's in the government.
Right, right.
So the amount of layoffs in the government is very, very important, and the lack of increase in government payrolls,
Yes.
which was out incredible in the Biden years and before Biden in the Obama years. Um, that detracts from productivity quite substantially, and we're going to see that change very dramatically. So I think that's a very important component of this.
330,000 so far laid off from government.
Yep, yep. And it's not just federal government,
No,
it's
no, right.
federal, state, and local. So hidden dangers behind 12% yield promise. So this is this whole credit, the implosion of these private credit companies, promising 12% returns to investors and lending it out to private companies. And, without really disclosing what they're doing or without proper disclosure of what they're doing, sort of, and here, I don't think Cathie mentions this or really focuses on it, but why did this happen? Tell you this why this happened is because the federal government shut down the banks.
Right.
The banks stopped lending to small businesses. And so who took over these private credit companies? And how did they do it? They charged very high interest and they promised a very high return. Well, many of them are being forced out now, and they're being forced out now because they're very bad practices, and they were there's one thing to have overregulation, but it's definitely another thing to have underregulation. And
Well,
so,
and in this case, some of it was caused by overregulation because it forced these small banks out. And the
yeah,
small banks were the ones that were making these loans. And now all of
yeah.
a sudden you've got these gigantic banks that have no interest in taking care of mom and pop down the street that needs 100 grand to get by.
But this still indicates that there's a crisis. The
Right.
indication is that the mom and pop businesses now can't resort to this kind of borrowing, they still have to have a bank, and the banks are not lending to
Right.
them.
Right. Exactly.
I think this is a hidden problem that somebody has to address. And if not this administration, who would, you know? So fewer jobs, faster productivity, bigger upside. So the decoupling of growth and labor. I mean, we've been talking about this, you know, every week so far that we've been together, but you know, we're watching growth happen, but at the same time, you're watching, you know, people being laid off. Now, a lot of people are being laid off, to your point, shouldn't have been hired in the very first place.
Or
So it's a
retained.
double whammy. It's not a single whammy, it's a double whammy, but it's structural, not just cyclical. The current softening employment isn't a recession signal. It's a sign of an AI-driven efficiency gain with permanently replacing headcount. The efficiency comes from the permanent replacement. And this is really the AI productivity divergence. This is a conceptual idea where the corporate output keeps climbing, and the gray line shows you the employment just remaining static, if not even declining. And it's just a concept. It's not real numbers.
Right, right, right. And I think we need to flesh this one out just a little bit more. The layoff numbers from Challenger in January and February were actually low. They were lower than last year. In fact, they're the lowest going back to 2002. So all of a sudden, the layoff picture has changed. You don't see anybody on X talking about that, of course. And that Challenger report just came out on the 5th. And so the layoffs are under control. So we're seeing what was talked about pretty much all of last year. You're not seeing layoffs, and you're not seeing hires. So both are happening simultaneously, which means that companies are fairly comfortable with their employment levels, and we're seeing that with the 4.4% unemployment rate.
All right. Well, let's move on then. So Cathie thinks that the deficit may improve faster than expected. The growth could shrink the fiscal gap, and it's possible. I think that the discombobulation from this war may be greater than Cathie's giving credence. You know, you can see diverging from her that she's not really focused on quite how bad this war is going to impact global trade. I see it as a very big impact on global trade. I see it as a relatively short circuit, but not weeks, months, and it's going to take time to recover. I think the recovery is going to be very great, but I think we may even see a shock to the market in this process. But the fiscal outlook, Cathie says the deficit is narrowing. It's recovering sharply from about 17.5% COVID trough to about 3% of GDP today. Department of Government efficiency initiatives likely to cut wasteful spending significantly. I think this is going to have a long-term impact on the government, interestingly enough, more so than the short term. The long term is going to be slow the growth of government expenditure, except for military. Military spending is going to go up higher. I don't think that that's serious. The real problem still remains Medicare and Medicaid. I've spoken about this at great length. And it's not just Medicare and Medicaid, it's the tax on people's pockets.
Right.
There's more tax being applied because of healthcare costs than even government taxes right now, and that's the most serious problem. So tax cuts aimed at stimulating GDP growth could increase total revenue. Consensus is too bearish. Markets expect persistent high deficits. ARC sees a potential for upside surprise similar to the late 90s. I'm aligned with that, but I think it's going to be 3 years' time, not 3 months' time.
Okay. And yeah, so productivity, tax cuts, productivity, printing money or not printing money. So these are the things that actually impact inflation. And if you want to get the deficit down, you could print your way out of it, but you create inflation. But if you get productivity, that then creates more taxes, more revenues naturally, which can bring the deficit down. My biggest concern about the short term on the deficit is the Supreme Court decision that the tariffs were not okay. That was really helping to bring the deficit down.
No, but it's a non-event. Those tariffs are going to be replaced with tariffs that are within Supreme Court parameters. It's a non-event. I mean, you should listen to our esteemed Secretary of the Treasury, Scott Bessent, on the subject. He's very definitive on them, so I don't think that it's a big deal.
We do have the question of what happens to the tariffs that were collected over the last year. That seems to be a little bit, I'm agreeing with you going forward. I'm talking about with regard to the 178 billion or something that was
It's
collected.
not money. It's not money. Look, the deficit is not a point in time. The deficit is what we see in the future. So, adding 170 to 3 trillion or 6 trillion or 10 trillion or 12 trillion is not even a decimal point change.
Okay.
What is important is direction.
Mm-hmm.
Much more important than the 130 or 300, whatever it happens to be. So even if there's a hiccup at the beginning because of the 170 or the 180 or 200, whatever it is, it's only a hiccup. What the economy is all about is the direction and the persistence over time.
Okay.
All right, so the yield curve says policy is still too tight. Hello. Hello. But, we only have a few more months of this idiot
Yeah, right.
in the Federal Reserve left who's acting in political ways. So the signal is still, we still have a spread that is inverted. The Fed is behind the curve. There's a huge recession risk. And I think we may see a double dip here before we get to the upside.
Mm-hmm.
And so as the Fed cuts rates to normalize the curve, long duration assets typically outperform. We'll see. I mean, that's her thesis, and she's sticking to it. I think that there's this short-term pain that we have to go through before we get this longer-term gain.
Well, she also points out that we've got this massive amount of tax positive the refunds from the big beautiful bill that'll be hitting here. They just started hitting. They'll be hitting through April. They'll be hitting business accounts as well because of all the changes in depreciation, et cetera. So all those things should help us for the next couple of months. And then the Federal Reserve Chairman comes in May rather. So it's only 2 months and a week away.
Yeah, right. Well, the yield curve, that's not going to help the yield curve. It'll help the yield curve the moment we get a new Secretary of Treasury. The Secretary of Treasury that's coming in is actually quite
Federal Reserve Chairman. I'm sorry.
Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve Chair that's coming in is actually quite a hawk. And, a lot depends on what happens between now and his arrival in terms of, the deficit, the war, just a lot of stuff. And so I would just be a little cautious about the immediate situation. But clearly, the tight money situation is, it has been a big factor in holding back this economy. And then what's interesting is that American output per employee has surged to an index of 115, way above the other so-called industrialized states. We don't have China in this map, unfortunately. I think the productivity output per employee is quite impressive in China. And I think what would be most impressive is to see it against Korea. Yeah. So that would be interesting, but we continue to, improve our productivity, even though it was relatively lower rate of improvement compared to this, the 2020 to 2022. But I mean, it's been very, if we go back, we can go back to the 80s and we'll see a very consistent rise in productivity.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but man, it's very worrying to see what Europe is doing. Very, very worrying. And it's hard to describe how bad Europe is. And China and Japan is not much. In fact, Japan is almost worse.
Yeah, well, wherever you have declining population, it becomes harder to have increased productivity. Although, to a certain extent, if you have fewer people in your population, you have to find ways to be able to make enough goods and services. So, robotics and whatnot are going to fill some of that gap. But it's still
Hopefully.
tough when you're declining
Yeah.
population.
Consumers stay shaken even as prices ease. So I think the labor anxiety is real. You know, we don't see it quite as bad as the 2021 peak. So I I think that it's an indicator that there's real anxiety about jobs and people are not putting their hands in their pocket as a result. Doge efficiency cuts and tariff rhetoric will create this wall of worry that Cathie talks about for households. There's no doubt that Democratic households are, aligned with these crazy, recession talks and depression talks and so on.
I've jumped into this so deep, Larry, the last week. We are 2% lower on the number of people, I'm sorry, 2% higher on the number of college graduates that are either unemployed or underemployed. It's 2% higher than the trend over 50 years.
I know, I
The
know.
number of weeks for people to get reemployed after they're laid off is normal. It's not low, it's not high. It's like right in the middle. So a lot of this is just fear mongering out there, and the fear mongering ends up being in these surveys.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you can read these numbers multiple ways, and definitely, you know, I think the sentiment that is being propagated by the popular press
Mhm.
or the left-wing press about the same, they mean the same thing, is not great. But and this war hasn't helped.
Mhm.
This war came at a very you know, uh, unfortunate moment. But there you are. This is where we are.
Mhm.
Um, so green shoots and a rolling recovery, housing turnaround. Boy, the housing market is beginning to hot up, no doubt about it.
This
I
is the
think
new housing market.
new housing. I mean, there's no doubt that we started calling this last month, or the month before, really, is when we
Mhm.
started calling it.
Mhm.
But once you get under a 6% mortgage rate, or at that 6% and just below, housing takes off because finally, about a third of the people who have the 2% mortgage have already
Mhm.
given up that 2% mortgage.
Right.
Now we're at a point where a very large percentage of those people who have that 2% mortgage and have been in their house for longer than traditional period of time, they're in a position now to move. And I think we're going to see them move.
Right.
And so there's new home inventory rising, and that will help unfreeze the market. And we're seeing tax refunds start coming out. I think we're going to see the market pick up. The market in my area has picked up dramatically just in the last 3 weeks. So
What is counterintuitive and not very much reported is that inventories are back to being very, very tight again. So
yeah,
people have taken their homes off the market. Some of the homes have been sold. People have not put their house back, So but I think the inventory will loosen up a little bit here as we get into
yes,
selling
it will.
season. And I think you're right. I think it's going to be a good selling season this year.
Yep, yep. Prices are going to track higher. People are going to say, "Oh, my word, we can
Got to get
actually
in.
get out of that." Yeah, yeah, yeah. Bitcoin, gold, and oil, key signals. Bitcoin versus gold, ratio remains constructive, making higher lows despite recent volatility. Cathie views Bitcoin as the emerging global monetary standard. So I would just caution everybody. I know Cathie's very high on it. I just have a very cautious approach and continue to hold that cautious approach.
We are aligned.
Credit quality. Junk bond spreads are near all-time lows. seeing public markets see no systemic stress, contrasting with private market fears. So that private market panic we're talking about, where these companies that jumped into the non-bank lending market for high interest loans to people who really needed credit very badly and are prepared to pay for it. That's one very small sliver of the market, but in general, the market remains pretty resilient.
Right. I think the major markets that we're talking about here would be the small banks and the small lending institutions who take care of the commercial real estate, the office space real estate, et cetera, et cetera. And these people were caught in this weird economy over the last several years. And they're apparently, we're getting through it. Everybody was very, very worried about this category of loans. Oh, this would also be small business loans who do have good credit, would also be in this group.
Yeah, yeah. So input costs, commodity index are rising slightly while consumer prices stay flat, which is potentially a market freeze for companies without pricing power. So people are going to have to save money by improving their processes, reducing their costs, and that's what's important. So again, innovation, deflationary boom, monetary pivot, convergence. So the all-at-once era that Cathie talks about is based upon very high levels of efficiency being eked out by using AI, bringing deflation, and then, as that inflation cools, the yield curve normalizes, the Fed is going to be forced to cut rates. Lower rates will disproportionately benefit long duration innovation assets. And then we get a convergence of all these technologies feeding one into each other. And there are so many examples of it. I think next time we meet, next month, I'm going to actually pull some examples, because so many have come to mind. Just in the time we have today, I haven't been able to develop that theme, but I'll play that theme because I've got some very real examples that are at my behest, at my personal experience. And as Cathie says, and this is where I'm aligned with her 100%, if not necessarily on the timing, but certainly in the medium term to long term trend, that the structural shift is just beginning. Despite all this noise, the underlying fundamentals of innovation are accelerating. Stay the course. And this just reminds me so strongly. And next time we meet, I'll talk about the conversation I had with my great friend, this very, very eminent economist, around the time of the beginning of AWS, the beginning of the 90s revolution, and we'll talk about that.
Okay. All right. Sounds good. All right, Larry, as always, everybody gives you a big thank you for putting together the slide deck. I understand, though, that AI might be putting you out of a job here because it's doing
pretty much. I've taught AI so well that because of the birthday celebrations this weekend, I really didn't have any time. So I downloaded Cathie's broadcast and gave it to Manus and said, "Look, just
do it.
You do it right. You don't need me anymore. You've been a good student. Now teach the teacher." And there isn't a single change I made to this deck. Not a single. As a matter of fact, this is the first time I'm seeing the deck.
Yes, right. Yes, that's pretty amazing. That gives everybody a really great example. If they stuck till the end, they got to see a phenomenal example. Let me just say really quickly that this morning I did an interview, or I posted an interview, actually at noon. So it'll be the first interview early this morning. I did it. Phil Beisel, actually did two Phil Beisels today already. But the first one this morning was all about a continuation of that conversation that started last Saturday, where Phil was talking about how Tesla is going to win the AGI race. And a lot of it will have to do with the real world information that's coming from Optimus. And that conversation has just been piling up. And so people that think we're still on the same wavelength as we were last Saturday, no, this is now an entirely new story because of Larry adding his thoughts and Cern adding his thoughts. And all week long, we've been adding to the story. So I just highly recommend people go back and see that. I will put a card up.
And you know what's interesting about this is it brings up the topic we were talking about last week.
Oh, it's funny. I was trying to get there. So let me set it up. Okay.
Go ahead, set it up because
it became the topic of the week. I don't know if you watched any of the videos that came out since then, but every single co-host has been challenged on this channel based on what you said. And we've put layers, talk about standing on the shoulders of a giant. We stood, you're a pretty big guy, right? Anyway,
yeah.
we stood on your shoulders and I said, okay, wait a minute. Here's Phil. And he says, look, Optimus can do multitasking, and the ability to do this multitasking allows us to get this real world data at such a massive level as these optimi are put loose. We're getting some of it from cars, but they're restricted in what they can get. But the Optimus will be unrestricted and will be able to interconnect with the other optimi around the world. And the combination will allow us to get real world data. And not only do we get the data and then we get to use that as part of AGI, getting to AGI, but for this real world data, we probably can't get to AGI.
Yeah.
So that's kind of where you and I left it.
Yeah. It's and you know, you encouraged and I took the took it up as, you know, my second Optimus article will drop on Tuesday is about this subject matter.
Okay.
Yeah, so we can talk about that next week. But yeah, I mean, what to kind of color that a bit, what I was attempting to say, well, a lot of things, and we don't have time to go into it deeply, but what I was attempting to say is that like we as humans have a very limited sensor set. We produce data that is compressed through all these things we just discussed, you know, whether it's bias or just whatever. And we create an intelligence on the other end, and that intelligence we call Anthropic or Chat GPT or Gemini or XAI. And we can ask it questions today that it'll give answers to that are just completely wrong, you know, and not just ideologically kind of wrong. I mean, like black and white wrong. Like, and what I was attempting to say is that us humans are now capable of building tools that then can put data into that system to increase what is intelligence without a human in the loop effectively, you know, and one of the tools that will be most important here will in fact be Optimus itself. So, you know, there's a difference. When we build a tool, like if you think about it, let's say that we're going collecting some kind of environmental data. Mm-hmm. And we go out as a group of humans, 10 of us, and we have a little sensor and we write down a number. And, you know, we did it at this time of day because why did this person go to this hill and take that piece of data? Well, you know, they were late. They had lunch with a friend and they were supposed to be there at noon, but they got there at 1. But they didn't want to say anything, so they wrote down 12, and then they wrote down the data point, and it's completely different than what would have really happened at the proper 12 o'clock hour. Okay, right. And then, you know, in the next layer would, okay, well, let's fix that problem. We'll dispatch a human-built tool called a sensor. We'll put, you know, fixed sensors in these locations, and we'll take readings, you know, blah blah blah. And what I'm trying to say, or what I am saying, is that something like Optimus is that next level tool. It both has it has mobility, but it also has agency, and the fact that it can now and it has this, you know, aggregate or fleet effect that we as humans can't. Our fleet effect is an expression through writing something down and having other people read it, and we're not a hive-minded kind of society. We don't have any real-time hive minding. But Optimus does.
Yes.
So Optimus can observe something, not only can observe something, but it can enact its own experiment. And it can then transmit the result of that experiment to the fleet and have the fleet come in line with that experiment. So like, for example, if it says, I was just told to go do this, but I observed that if I did this, it caused this outcome. I should observe that outcome. In other words, an experiment.
Mhm.
I can readily tell the fleet to do all this and collect that data. And now I can inject that into a new or like co-resident or new AI that truly gets us to a better artificial general intelligence, because we as humans think, well, that artificial general intelligence is just the Turing test. It's just to get past the human filter of what is, is this thing a human or not? And can we ask it all these questions? And does it have the aggregate intelligence of all humans? Because it would, because it's an LLM, because it's taken in all this data. But that's not good enough, right? That's not even close to good enough. In fact, it may be 0.001% of all data that's formed our backbone of intelligence is just limited by all these things that limit humans' ability to do it. But the good news is, and what I point out in this article, is that we as humans are pretty intelligent because we can build tools to take it to the next level.
Right. Yeah,
And
we get superhuman from fire, from wheels, from pulleys. I mean, all of these
yeah,
tools
right,
created,
right,
all of these tools made us superhuman,
right.
gave us capabilities way beyond the human being. So as this developed during the week, there was a couple of things. One in particular, I think, I'm not going to go into all of them, but I think the biggest one was, and I want to say, I can't remember who it was, so I'm not going to say and get it wrong. It might have been me. Anyway, no, it wasn't. It wasn't me. I can remember that. Anyway, but the idea was that it's coming back. The idea is we're relying on AI, digital AI, and it's wrong at least 4% of the time. I think the industry would be happy if it was getting 96% right answers. And
Mhm.
I'm even talking about math. I'm even talking about physics. Uh,
Talking about like so-called objective things.
objective things, but
Yeah.
we're getting about 90. I think the idea is that we're narrowing, and we're doing a good job of, I can't do this, narrowing this funnel of bad information, but
Mhm.
we're still a long way from getting to anything close to something that's true on a regular basis on the most fundamental things. And yet we have a vehicle that weighs 4,000 or 3,000, 4,000, whatever pounds, driving around at 80, 70, 80 miles an hour that can kill people. And it's right, 99 and some number of point nines after that. And it has to be, or it's worthless. It's useless. We
Right.
can't even put it on the road.
Right. That's a very good point. If it was at 96%, it would be a completely worthless
Completely
product.
worthless. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So all of a sudden, the physical AI that you were talking about last week, the ability of robots to gather this data in a way that is extremely accurate, and then for us to be, as humans, to be able to direct the AI in order to get it better and better and better and better through experimentation, through cross-checking between the fleet, through even going back into digital AI and getting information back to the fleet that helps it to understand what it's doing and why, et cetera. That combination, I think, my personal opinion is, we wrote it in the book months and months and months ago, is absolutely a necessity to get to AGI.
Yeah. Right. I mean, if it's artificial general intelligence, it doesn't mean that it's human intelligence.
Right.
It doesn't mean that. It's something else. Yet, and of course, there's no bright line for it either. I want to point that out as it's a silly thing, is that we arrived at this moment, and people call it the singularity or something. I don't think that that's how this will be. But the point is, one thing I can be certain of is that the amount of information, the intelligence of this thing cannot be just what humans have observed. Even if humans can be bias-free entities, our sensor sets alone, I mean, think about all the physical reality that is occurring in some different part of the electromagnetic spectrum that is not within our visible. We take in that electromagnetic spectrum through our eyes, and we're not seeing infrared, we're not seeing ultraviolet, we're not seeing 99% of that spectrum or whatever. And just think about how limited the knowledge that we like, oh, the world is what we see visibly. Really? That's really interesting to think that that's no. Now we can create a tool to look in the infrared. We can create a tool to look in the ultraviolet. That tool could be even Optimus, depending on how, like it's so interesting to think that in the beginning of time, Optimus will largely be handed sensors that really mimic human sensors, right? Like looking at the visible world. Like when we think of we think about FSD as a good example of this. FSD mostly is just taking in light in the visible spectrum that we humans too can see, and making driving decisions based on that.
Right.
And yet at some level, it's doing it a little bit more without the human interpretation, because it's at some level it's doing it at a raw photon count level,
Right.
which is different than sending it through, like what I tell people, and what I've written about in those FSD articles, is that the AI that represents FSD is using raw Bayer filter image data that we as humans, if laid out on a table, would look at that and go, I don't really recognize the traffic light in there. I don't recognize but yet it's in there. It's encoded in that data, and that data is the input data for the AI, not converted through an image signal processor that creates an output that is comfortable for humans.
Right.
Now, every single human who has an opinion about FSD, and especially those who have the negative opinion, can't understand it, because they layer the human sensor set on top of it and go, well, I can't understand how it could do this, because look what humans do, and therefore it's like, okay, that's your interpretation of something that's actually not even happening.
Right.
At the rawest level in this AI, and that is a good way of saying that if we create tools that have broad sensor sets that can observe reality outside of human confines, both sensor and interpretation, then we can reach a closer approximation to real intelligence. Now, what I might add is we're also effing this up, because we're creating tools that only the human can imagine to create, and we don't know if the agency of these tools will be such that it can free think the problem and create derivative tools that therefore can and be more truth seeking or data seeking or information seeking beyond what we can imagine. So what I'm saying is, here right now, what we're doing is we're creating a layer of tools, and some of those tools can have great agency, mobility and agency, Optimus being my prime example of the coolest one. But can it then therefore create its own tools and to run its own experiments and so forth? And this comes all the way back, I hate to say it, to our interpretation of what we were talking about, this Anthropic Department of War thing, because to me it comes back to Elon's concept of we need AIs that are truth seeking. Not just truth emitting, but he talks about truth seeking. And it's interesting that he he talks about the seeking part of this, as opposed to just the emitting part of this, right? Emitting truth is interesting, but seeking truth means that there's some agency.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he's hoping, crossing his fingers as much as we are, that if we get to that threshold and we create that type of AI, that it recognizes that humans are good and we should be preserved.
I think most of the people that I'm listening to think that this is the next level. It still won't get to 100% AGI, but now that we've got reasoning, memory, added to what we already had in the AI world, that and now we're getting the agency, so the agents can go out and be a little more capable, I guess would be the right way to put it, and do more work. That when you combine all those together, we may get to a level which some people claim they are seeing, which is recursive, or where there's some kind of learning that's taking place within the system that they can then use to become better.
Yeah, that's what I mean by the tool creating the tool.
Exactly. I
Effectively.
thought
Yeah.
you did, but I wanted to say it a different way.
Yeah.
So if we get recursive learning, that's the point. Some people have said that this is the reason why the first person to AGI, or the first person that has recursive learning in their computers, their frontier model, the first person that has that will win the entire day if they can do if it's regular. It can't be one time. Oh, I got a little recursive learning here. But if one of these systems starts to commonly learn from, improve, and then improve upon itself, that then it's all over for the other frontier models, because that system will just rapidly, you know,
Yeah.
accumulate knowledge that the other systems.
And it gets, I mean, it gets both exciting and scary because,
Yeah,
it does lead to moments where we don't know we won't know necessarily until certain
right.
things occur that these AIs have done this thing. And then this is why, look, this is why we're all concerned about this. I mean, like if we're being fair to Anthropic or any of these guys, I don't think the approach that anybody is taking here necessarily, like when I think about Anthropic as a company, whether I agree or disagree with their fundamental philosophies, I don't think that they're trying to, they're not evil, and they're not trying to
Right.
to create extinction event for humanity. They're just trying to save it in their very little limited way, which is what is causing the problem here, because everybody has an interpretation of how they think these tools should behave. They're not, they're complex, and as I said, like one of the ways to remove the complexity is to not treat them as complex. On one, like just treat them like a bullet, and say the Department of War gets to use a bullet
Anyway.
in a way that is lawful,
Right.
and that three branches of government hopefully got it right, and the checks and balances are in place. Otherwise, all hope is lost anyway, right? Or our government gets taken out by another government to solve the problem.
Mhm.
Or we can let private enterprise suddenly, act like judge, jury, and godlike, and this is the problem that we find ourselves in, and why this topic is interesting in this era of tools.
Right. All right. And by the way, there's a chapter, I actually wrote it in the book AI Rising, which talks about, I think, 17 different problems that we face as AI becomes better and better. And we try in that chapter to deal with not only the problem, but also, to the extent that there is a solution, at least address potential solutions. Well, okay, that was deep. I've talked about it a couple of times over the last few days, but Jim Farley just tore down a Tesla for the first time. It's beyond my imagination that he is only finally now figuring out how much better a Tesla is than his Fords. But it's true, that's what he did. And well, if it took him this long to tear down a Model 3 or Model Y, whatever it was that he tore down, imagine how long it might take him before he tears down a cybercab, which has even more radical, more crazy technology in it than the Model 3 or the Model Y had. So I've got the perfect guy for this. He used to work for Rivian, and he knows a little bit about car design, architecture, etc. Phil Beisel, you've got some new stuff to talk about that
Yeah.
Elon liked yet again. I am going to have to change my X methodologies. I never get likes from Elon. I got one so far, one ever.
I'm 4 for 5 this week on my posts. Yeah. The funny part is I think he's like, yeah, I like that. Don't tell anybody, you know. But yeah, because I think sometimes I get really close to the secret sauce. Yes. So, um, yeah, this is a really interesting topic to talk about because uh, cybercab is a great departure in engineering from what has come before it, including almost all other Tesla models. Okay, and they are technologically a great departure from what came before it, which is effectively legacy auto. So we are now, 2 orders of magnitude down the departure path of architectures of vehicles, and it's like there is no logical or sensible way that our legacy automakers will ever catch up. I mean, it's a different product now. And as we know, one of the things about Cybercab that's super interesting is this is probably the first time that Cybercab and the robots that make Cybercab are sort of like one product in a sense. This new manufacturing process, which takes the human out of the loop. And I believe it's the first time any auto has ever been created without a human in the loop. And that is not to say that the human doesn't show up at the end to run a few tests and plug in a few things and wipe the windshield. But effectively, there's a robot building this product, a set of robots building this product as a series of major assemblies.
Mm-hmm.
And if we go back, let's go back to kind of foundational automotive manufacturing. Typically, what you have is this manufacturing line where it leads down to, you do have some major assemblies that are built. Obviously, an engine built in a Ford vehicle can be built in another plant and then brought over. Transmission type, obviously there's large components, and so you've got suppliers, and then Ford or General Motors becomes their own supplier of major components, and then these things arrive at the main general assembly factory to then produce the vehicle. And then there is usually almost not in every case, actually, there's the general assembly line at the end where you have a bunch of humans in the loop that are walking a car down and fixing it with doors and the seats. And it's a very labor-rich, labor-intensive process. These guys have drills and rubber hammers on them and torquing wrenches and all that kind of stuff where they're assembling the product. And as it goes down this, sometimes it's a moving conveyor where they join the conveyor and they move along with it before they kind of team A that's responsible, say, for maybe putting the doors on. And other times it's done differently. But in other words, sometimes the car moves, sometimes the people move with the car. But it goes back to old style, kind of how Henry Ford invented this whole assembly line. And Tesla vehicles up until Cybercab are largely done that way. I mean, when I say largely, there's more robots involved, there's more major assemblies, there's less ridiculous electronics. We're going to get into the weeds on that. But at the end of the day, there's this sort of general assembly process, and it goes, CyberCab completely different, unboxed manufacturing process completely different, and I don't think people appreciate how radical of departure that is. What they're doing with CyberCab, and we've talked about this, but is they're taking these major assemblies and they're snapping them together at the end of the line. So the end of the line isn't this long, drawn out thing. It is literally like snapping 3 Lego parts or 5 Lego parts together, doing a final test and shoving it out of the factory. And Elon made some interesting comment about that it kind of resonated with me, is that he said, it's sort of like the mind of Elon. He walks in the factory, he sees something different than you and I might see. Certainly me. He walked in the factory and he said, and Lars described this, his VP of engineering. I think they were together once, and Elon was making some comment about, what we're doing is we're pushing a lot of, as we push our vehicles forward, we're pushing a lot of air. Mm-hmm. And what he meant by that is, if you think about the volume of the factory, and you think about the shell of the car, and you think of the volume of that, and you think about the interior of that, and 50% of it is just a bunch of air that they're moving. Now, it's not weight, it's not kind of cost, but it's space.
Right.
It's utilization of space improperly. And Elon kind of looked at this and said, why is so much of the volume of this entire factory about moving this, why is it so much empty space?
Yeah. And the most telling or visual part of that was that the car gets painted all at once, dipped, sprayed, whatever. Yeah. But the spraying booth or the dipping booth for the car has to be, for the car, the way that it's designed now is massive. Whereas if you're painting the doors, they can be almost stacked, if you will, as they go through the paint. If you're, fenders, etc., they're not moving the volume of air into and out of the paint room.
Yeah, I mean, you look at these factories and they're large, for many reasons. I mean, first, they're building a large object.
Right.
I mean, it's not like there's a reason the Boeing factory is big, and tall, whereas
or the new Starship factory.
Yeah. I mean, you have to be able to house the object, but there's an obvious efficiency if you can create density in the space. And the density would be that in the case of CyberCab, what you do is you build these major assemblies, and it doesn't really matter. We don't have to be precise about whether they're 4 or 5, 2 or 3. It's irrelevant. But basically, you've got sort of the powertrain of the vehicle, which includes the battery and the motors, and then you've got the sides and the front, and they come together really at the very end of line, and so they're built with great parallelism, and the more parallelism, this greater this density, clearly, which is efficiency, and then of course it's just compresses time dramatically, and in fact, this is built. This robot on wheels is being built by robots, and as such, this entire compression led to another reality, which is that you can't really have a human in the loop because the robots are moving too quickly and the human can't be safely involved. So they are extracted from the process. And therefore, CyberCab can be delivered at a cadence of, in volume every 10 seconds, which is literally insane for the type of object we're talking about here. But it is a very first principles way of thinking about the manufacturing process. And now what has happened here is what people, I think, don't realize is that normally the way a product is designed, and when I say this, it's not all or nothing, it's just sort of, is that there's a set of engineers that are designing the product, and they usually essentially throw it over the fence to manufacturing and say, now build this thing. As opposed to real serious design for manufacturing, where, that's where all the efficiencies can be realized, and costs and efficiencies lead to dramatic cost savings in the product, reduce parts, reduce labor. If you start with this notion that I'm going to build a car for the very process of how it's going to be built, you think of the product as the factory as much of the factory as much of is the product as much as the vehicle itself, then all of a sudden that's a different process completely. And in Tesla, that is why Lars runs both manufacturing and engineering, right? Because that allows one executive to oversee this entire thing and be responsible for this entire thing, independent of Elon's direction. It's organizationally set up that way. So I wrote a post this week, and I'm going to share some slides that illuminate this to a certain extent, hopefully to a good extent. And I suppose you can see that.
Yep.
Yeah, let me put it in local slideshow mode. Now I assume you can still see it.
Yeah, see it better now.
I'm doing well. So I start off with saying, to understand the complexity of vehicles design, look at its wiring harness. And this was up for about 10 minutes before our friend Elon liked it. And it is true. If you look at the wiring harness of a vehicle, you immediately understand how good or bad the entire design of the vehicle is.
Could we call it the nervous system of the vehicle?
Yeah, and I'll show you some pictures in a second. But if you can reduce the mass of that wiring harness, you can reduce complexity, cost, weight. And let's go to the next slide. Here's what wiring harnesses look like in legacy auto. So I don't know, and I don't care which cars these are particularly, but on the left, I don't know what it was, but that's sort of the wiring harness ripped out of a particular vehicle. Now, what you should see is a lot of wires there, a lot of heavy wires there. If you pick that up, that's way over 100 pounds worth of stuff. And the more copper running through the car, and the heavier it is, and the more it costs. The heavier it is, it dramatically affects all aspects of the design of the vehicle. If you look to the right, the red in that vehicle is showing like all the different wiring components that are running through the vehicle. It's quite insane in legacy auto. And one of the reasons that it is insane is because up until recently, there was really, cars in the early 70s had no real computers in them, and they didn't really have a control center per se. But as they got through the 80s and so forth, they started to evolve to an architecture where there was effectively a bit of a central computer in the car. So, for example, if you've got a fob and you unlock your legacy auto vehicle, 4 doors unlock, and maybe the trunk, and which means that then that signal's got to go through some telecommunications component that then has to go to a computer. The computer's got to send signals down the wire to these microcontroller unlocking controllers, or locking controllers, and affect the unlock command, and then obviously lock too. And normally the way that was done in legacy to a certain extent is that, for every micro ECU, for every microcontroller, that, for every little piece of power electronics that managed a function in the car, whether it's locks or seats, there would be a wire that kind of goes back to central. And sometimes that wire was smaller, and sometimes it was, like you can see in this diagram on the left, you see if you look carefully, you see like a lot of taping around the harness, because what they're doing is they're bundling all these wires together as a fabric of, this is insanity. I mean, this is pure insanity. This is like inelegant design getting away from us, like literally. And what's happened here is this started out rather comfortably because there was not a lot of electronics in the car. There was a small number of electronics in the
Right.
car. So, obviously lights were electric and so forth and needed power, but there wasn't a lot of independent controllers and so forth. So it started out and grew incrementally. Like no one literally looked at the problem and said, well, we need a new architecture here.
Right.
Because and so basically, it just grew more heads. It just grew and grew and grew. Uh,
Kind of reminds me up in your neck of the woods in Northern California, we have something called the Winchester House,
yeah, the Winchester Mystery
which was
House. Yeah,
which was built by the Winchester, I think the next generation, maybe it might have been the original generation. Anyway,
yeah,
they just kept getting more and more rooms, more and more additions to the house without taking any consideration for what the rest of the house had already done. So you have stairways that lead to doors that don't, there's no door. You have rooms that have no way to get into the rest of the house. I mean, it's hilarious to walk around this place because it's like they just kept, plopping on
yeah,
another piece
yeah.
without.
And it's a spectacle now, right? It's like a
Right.
yeah. It's a good analogy. I mean, it's quite the disaster. This incrementalism of engineering, like there was not a strong. I always come back to where's your leadership in a company and why isn't some and most of the time is because the leadership is not at all technical and therefore the function is so over time the organizations become so uh, stovepiped in their own little domain that they just want to be connected to power and leave us alone and we're going to go off and do our own thing and there is no redo. There's no strong engineering redo of a product. And
And imagine what that might look like. Because let's say, you're changing models, and this new model is going to have 15 speakers in it instead of the last model that only had 5 speakers. And these speakers are going to be placed at new places around the car. And now you've got to wire to all those speakers in order to make them work.
yep,
And so, but that might mean that you've changed the way that the locking mechanism that you were talking about, you're changing the way that that wiring needs to go in order to complement the way that the speaker harness. I mean, the complexity of it is overwhelming,
yep,
but you've got each little department. You've got the audio department that's not speaking to the lock department, who's not speaking to
right.
the electric seat department, who's not talking about the air conditioning department.
Yeah, I
And
mean, you
so,
may have someone in charge of the wiring harness,
right.
but remember what their job is. They're just basically to
Get it done.
shove all the wires in the harness, like get it as tight and their job might be to snake it around the car most efficiently. Don't it's not as if there isn't really thought here, but at the end of the day, this problem is inescapably obvious. Like, look what happened.
Yeah.
Um, Now let's jump into cybercab and talk about
By the way, one more aside. One of the reasons that they scrap cars now, the whole car in accidents faster than they used to, is because of this wiring problem. It's
yeah, that right. I mean, it's
so expensive to fix the wiring problem. You've had this much of the car destroyed. Okay, just the wiring alone is going to cost us so much to fix. We might
that's
as well
right.
scrap the entire thing.
That's correct. It's once you bundle all these wires together, it's difficult to unravel what the problem is, and it's hard to, as the harness becomes kind of a single big spider object, it's hard to then decouple it and fix any component of it. So yeah, it's kind of gross. Let's look at cybercab and understand what's going on here. And it is a radical departure, a radical departure. It doesn't look anything like what we just saw. And it starts with this uh, data and power backbone. And the data backbone is called Etherloop. And we'll jump into some of the details about it. And then there's power. So let's talk about power first. Much like cyber cab, which I think is the first vehicle to do this, and I believe the Model 3, current Model 3 is doing this as well, is a 48 volt architecture. So that's an important thing to understand what's going on here is if you look at wiring, if you look at carrying power to a device, that is power or watts is always amps or the current times the voltage, right? And if you effectively can take the voltage, so traditional auto is 12 volt, everything's 12 volt. We know our batteries are 12 volt, and we know that all the devices that hang off of them are 12 volt. And if you take that 12 volt and you move it up to 48 volts, to get the exact same power, you can reduce the amperage, the current, by 4 times. So whatever the amperage was, you can reduce, and you get the same exact outcome. The important reality of that is that what determines the gauge of wire is the amperage, not the voltage. So if you increase the voltage by 4x, reduce the amperage by 4x, you can effectively drop the gauge of the wire appreciably, which means that you've dropped the weight of the wiring harness, regardless of whether you did any re-architecture or not. You drop the weight significantly.
And the cost.
So what? Sorry?
And the cost.
Yes, and the cost, of course, right. So now what was copper at certain weight is less, and therefore the cost is less, and so forth. And this is without any re-architecture. But here's the thing. You can't just run 48 volt and call it a day. The problem is that every small device, door controllers, various little sensors, taillights, you name it, are all on 12 volt. And to understand what's going on here is that suppliers in the auto industry, Tesla, while being a vertically integrated company, is not going down to the door controller. And the door controller isn't just a small little microcontroller that receives a command to unlock and lock. It's the entire lock and unlock assembly, right? They're getting that from a supplier. Now, could they build that themselves in a vertically integrated fashion? Sure. Should they? Probably not. They've got enough things Tesla's built enough things on its own. Now, there are probably some small controllers that they've picked off, meaning they've said it's worth our time and energy to go and build this ourselves or get a supplier to rebuild it for 48 volt or something. But so now if you have an existing door controller and it's 12 volt, that comes with the little microcontroller that unlocks and locks the door, and then the locking mechanism itself, that's not going to change, right? It's not going to change. It still needs to operate on its 12 volt signal. But what's more important than that is that 12 volt signal on the 12 volt on the wire, excuse me, the signal to lock and unlock that, not just the power component, but the signal runs on a architecture that's kind of evolved since the 70s, late 70s, called CAN. CAN stands for, I think, Common Area Network, and it's a bus architecture. I can explain what that means in a second, but basically, all these I should explain it now. In a bus architecture, essentially everybody's on the wire. Okay, everybody's on the wire for that network. And they all have their own little addresses. They're all known as, I'm 6 and I'm 5 and I'm 4. So if a command is sent down that wire, in the beginning of that command addresses number 4, only number 4 is going to respond. Okay. So now typically the cars not only are running power to devices to power them, but they're also running these CAN networks. And you can have a single CAN bus run around the car. You can have multiple CAN buses. Like there may be in some architecture, maybe just for door type of things. There might be, depends on how you want to arrange it in the wiring harness and so forth. But and there's nothing wrong really with CAN. You can't it's it's a very limited, the amount of data on the wire is extremely limited. Um, there are they've had to get more data on the wire. They've had to go to ways that they've stacked up the data in multiple packets and larger frames. And there's a lot of stuff that they had to do because CAN was never really meant to carry data. It was meant to more carry signal, like commands, like unlock, lock, as opposed to, oh, here's a sensor over here that's going to bring back, like a on a Tesla vehicle. Here's a sensor is a multi-megabit 60 frame a second camera that's going to be, look at this amount of data. CAN is not really well suited for bringing that data. So what they do is they build this Ethernet backbone, like a 10 megabit, what's called two-wire automotive Ethernet. And they build a backbone and they put it in sort of a loop. It runs the loop of the car effectively. And they call it Tesla calls it ether loop, and I'll explain why in a minute. But it is Ethernet, and meaning that at the lowest level, each device it's a bus oriented network, meaning each device everybody's on the wire. And that means that everybody has to have an address, and those addresses are called MAC addresses. All our devices today, whether they're Wi-Fi or, everything has a MAC address, and those are unique addresses. I forget how big they are, some certain number of bytes, but they're unique. So, and in other words, they come to that device as a unique address that comes from the factory, and there's a committee that assigns blocks of these addresses and so forth, and every device on a network that's Ethernet or Ethernet compatible types of things have MAC addresses. Okay, so now what do they do here? Not only do they build a backbone of a power backbone at 48 volt, but they also build a network backbone, Ethernet backbone, and then it fans out to these. Think of the in purple here as a central computer, sort of a central point, main vehicle computer, but then it fans out to these zonal controllers. And not coincidentally, these zonal controllers are contained in the large modular components of the unboxed subcomponents, right? So if you've got this front assembly connecting, it may have its own zonal controller for the light bar and whatever it needs to control. So now what they do is they essentially build an abstraction to the old style smaller ECUs that are both 12 volt and respond to CAN, and they just finger a little CAN wire out into that door assembly that runs by these legacy or supplier style door controllers, et cetera, that are on 12 volt and they're on CAN. So in other words, you can keep the legacy components that the suppliers deliver to you, but what you've done by creating this small wire Ethernet backbone and getting it to a zone controller, you let the zone controller then do the signaling out and managing that type of thing. So what this does is, instead of this sort of centralized wires that run from the main computer all the way to the actual small door controllers and taillights and so forth, now there's power and network that runs to a zonal controller, and the zonal controller then manages that behavior out.
Let's see. Could I say to a certain extent, hub and spoke?
Yeah.
So
Yes.
you have Atlanta, you've got Chicago, you've got Dallas. Yes. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. So, and as I said, not coincidentally, the zonal controllers are in the major assemblies. Mm-hmm. So now if you're going to, in the manufacturing process, if you're going to snap together, now go back to the wiring harness and imagine trying to snap together major sub-assemblies of the vehicle. but yet you've got this stringed harness. You can't do that, right? You can't have. So instead, what you have is you essentially have interconnects. Now, I haven't seen them, but I pretty much know what they look like. Is if you're going to snap one thing, now all you've got is like little connectors that connect power and Ethernet. And that's all you need to do. You don't need to connect all these other wires. You don't need to have a big connection block and somehow fuse these wires together. You just have really two wires.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so that's genius, really. But what's important to understand about this is that it requires everything to come together as an architecture, right? It's not like you could effectively do this zonal architecture in electrical group, but it would be hard not to talk to the software group to make this work. And you could avoid talking to the manufacturing people. You could say, well, this is just how it works, make it happen. But this is all done as a holistic design. And so you can see that this drops potentially thousands of dollars, hundreds or at least 100 pounds of weight out of the vehicle, and much greater, simplicity. So now, if, for example, to your point about some damaged component, you could replace the controller and, just the component itself, or you could just replace maybe in cybercabs, it's so inefficient to bother. You just trash the car. It doesn't really matter. But at least there's some opportunity to now replace the major assembly. And this is really genius, right? And Rivian's new architecture is a bit of a copy of this as well. The Rivian Gen 2 architecture of the new vehicles, although I don't think they use 48 volt. And it doesn't, this isn't predicated, like you don't have to start with 48 volt to get this outcome. But 48 volt is magic because of what we talked about in terms of wiring. And by the way, the other side of that coin is you can't do 48 volt unless you do this, because how are you going to run 48 volt and convert it to 12 volt and different signal at the door controller? So you need to have somebody as the hub for that. It's good stuff. Now, Etherloop, let's talk a little bit about Etherloop itself and what that Ethernet backbone looks like, okay? Typically, when we think of Ethernet, we're thinking about a cable, right? We're talking about physical networking. We're thinking about a cable. And we're thinking about at the lowest level, devices have a fixed address called a MAC address. And therefore, we can transmit data to those things by virtue of understanding what two important things about networking is framing. Framing means like what's the beginning of a block of data to the end of a block of data. And then addressing, like how do you tell this block of data to go to that device? So the MAC address covers that. And then there's some elements of framing that, we don't need to discuss. But when then you jump above that and you think, well, what are we going to stick on top of this Ethernet? It's almost 99% or synonymous with the term TCP/IP, okay? Because everybody thinks, well, our networks are TCP/IP networks, and in the wired days when we had Ethernet running around, we thought about the RJ45 style connectors for Ethernet, although that wasn't required that it goes on that type of cabling. We would logically think that we're using standard internet style protocols, TCP/IP. Tesla does not do that. Tesla, now, could they do it? Yes, they could. In fact, Rivian uses TCP layered on Ethernet for the backbone of their vehicle, and they're successful with it. But Tesla chose a different path, and they called it Etherloop. And so what they've done is they decided that they wanted to have more deterministic integrity to the network itself. So the way TCP, the way Ethernet works in a typical way is that something gets transmitted on the wire, and anybody can effectively transmit it at any time. And when it transmits, it can, if somebody's transmitting at exact time, remember these time windows are, microsecond kind of stuff. It can collide with somebody else wanting to transmit at the same time, and therefore the data can get corrupted, and the transmitter has to know that it needs to try again, and usually it's fairly successful. Tesla took a different approach, and what they did was they used a time division model where they, when the car boots up and this Ethernet gets set up, all the major players on that Ethernet, and so in this case, think of these 4 zone controllers plus the central computer. Think of this as a diagram. It's not, there's probably 10 more, 20 more, or, it doesn't really matter. But all those guys have to, all of them have to be capable to make this ether loop work. All of them have to be capable of time synchronizing. And I'll explain why in a sec. And so they start off and they use some kind of time protocol where somebody has like a master clock. So in other words, everybody's got a little clock running around, right? And those clocks have to be synchronized down to some microsecond accuracy. And so once, as the car boots up, they first dispatch a bunch of this I think it's like a time protocol is called something like PTP. And they synchronize all these devices that want to talk on this Ethernet network. And everybody then assigns themselves a set of higher level addresses that, and those addresses relate to time slots, or should I say it the other way? They assign themselves addresses, and then they take on a number of well-known time slots. So, for example, the central computer may say, I want 5 time slots, and the zonal controller 2 may say, I want 2 time slots. And this is hard-coded, and these things boot up, and they assign themselves these slots, and then all of a sudden now they can be certain without any collision on the wire that they're able to transmit their data in their known time slot. As long as all the clocks are synchronized, zone 1 guy can transmit data exactly when he's allowed to. He doesn't have to, but that's when he owns the wire.
Right.
And he gets to put his data on the wire. And it creates this deterministic certainty. And it's important, or it's at some level important in auto when you have like safety critical things in the loop, right? So that means like if you're feeding, like Tesla vehicles are unique in the sense that you've got 8 cameras feeding into the FSD computer,
right,
and that data has to get there.
Yeah.
You can't end up corrupted along the way. There needs to be certainty. So this ether loop protocol that they developed creates this certainty of data transmission between these various ECUs. And that's the magic of all this, right? And all this is layered and stacked up so that we have a complete product that is not only is electrically architected in a way that fits the modularity, that fits the manufacturing. And that's the beauty of this vehicle.
Yeah. And so once again, I think from the beginning of them explaining this, I've pictured that harness that you showed in the first slide, and some of the conversations around it of even in the Tesla vehicles, a human being having to get inside the body in white and actually make sure that all these harnesses are going where they need to go, and then finishing off the cloth or whatever's covering them. All this has to take place. It's all handwork, very, very strenuous, because you're climbing inside the body of white to do this. But now what we're talking about, if I understand it correctly, is these 5 components of vehicle. The 5 vehicle components come together. Each one of them has a has a plug, and it's plugging into the next section.
Yeah.
And that is the wiring setup. No humans needed. No complexity of laying it out.
Yeah.
Completely.
I'm sorry.
I just say completely different.
Yeah, completely different. You picked up, you see this blue ring here, which is the ether loop backbone. This isn't meant to be.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, it's going to be very small power cable because of 48 volt and a very small network cable that's kind of wrapped together, and that's effectively the harness, the real component of the harness. And now, believe me, you've got a lot of fingering wires going out to all the little pieces, but those are coming from the zonal controllers themselves to those elements. Um, and from time to time, there's something like the central computer or whatever we're calling it, is going to run a wire from here to somewhere, right? I mean,
Right.
it's not
Right.
like it effectively acts as its own, let's call it zonal controller zero, but it just has a lot more function in it. Um,
Now, doesn't Cybertruck have some Wi-Fi also? And will Cybercab have some Wi-Fi also, where we're talking about no wiring, just
yeah, but not for the purpose of moving data around the car. The Wi-Fi would be for moving data off or into the car. So, there's a telematics component that will have the major telematics types of things networking on it, like Wi-Fi, cellular, Bluetooth, and those things would be talking to things outside the vehicle,
okay.
right? So the Wi-Fi is going to be joined to the central computer, telematics component of the central computer, and it's going to then therefore take data off of the loop or put data on the loop, depending on what we're doing here. So, for example, let's say that you were attempting to do an over-the-air update. And so the first thing is, you see some notification on your Tesla app that says there's an update available for your car. You say start. By saying start, essentially, you're sending a command to that purple computer to say, go grab that thing, if you haven't already grabbed it. And grab it means that you're bringing it over, principally Wi-Fi as you connect it to your garage, from Tesla's data center, the package, the software update package. And then it gets staged first on the central computer. Now, the central computer now has to verify the image, from a security and integrity point of view, and then distribute, and then decomponent, break it into its component parts, and send it off to the zonal computers to either update their own firmware or the downstream firmware. So, for example, believe it or not, some of these little teeny things like a door module or something may have its own way to update its software, although that's obviously pretty infrequent, but there are bugs in these things.
Yeah.
And there is a way to update that little component as well. And then it's really the zonal controller's job to manage that update, even though the main computer's got to kind of manage that. So, at the larger level of knowing, did all this stuff happen or not, right, across the vehicle. So, one last comment about this, and I think we can put this to bed.
Okay.
Guess what? Yeah. Now this is, excuse the silly diagram here that was done through obviously AI. Trying to replicate the previous diagram here. But what I'm getting at, and I don't think that this is exactly true, but what I am saying is that that in the chest cavity, so to speak, of our Optimus bot, there will be some central computer, and there'll be the largest computer in the system with all the inference chips on it for running the AI of the bot. It will have the telematics stuff we talked about, being able to have it talk to networks, probably have 5G and Wi-Fi in each Optimus bot, and it will effectively have zonal controllers in the sense that it will most certainly have an ether loop backbone. I guarantee that they will replicate what they've developed for, first, that ether loop. Think ether loop predates Cybercab, cab, but really came into its own in cybercab with the 48-volt architecture, and now is the de facto way that they're building their distributed architectures, and Optimus will benefit as well. So now the difference in Optimus is that they don't really have a supply chain that are those, like there is no door controller from some supplier, so that essentially they now have, this is a different device. This is where they're going, fully vertically integrated, where they have to build their own actuators and so forth. And what that means is that now, for the first time, this is a way to get rid of weight and complexity as well, is that these small little power electronics that manage the actuator, how the hands are, all these things will all be like directly on the 48-volt architecture.
Yeah.
So they don't need a translation out to 12-volt and CAN. There's no more CAN. There'll be no CAN bus inside of the Optimus. It'll just be the networking standard will be Ether loop on top of Ethernet, or Ether loop style Ethernet. So we'll have the same big style architecture, which effectively means kind of the same thing, that although you don't really think about it the same way, you can build the sub-assemblies and snap them together as well. I mean, I don't know how they might do that, but I suspect an ARM might snap in with both some kind of socket connector for the physical, but also there's probably power and network, much like the sub-assemblies of cybercab. So cool stuff, huh? Yeah.
Cool. Very, very cool stuff. I could imagine some of this coming over into kids' toys, where these assemblies would now be in a similar way. And when you put them together, they would just, again, the snap together with the electronics and the physical part, all being one snap, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a dramatic difference than what's being done at Legacy. I mean, at the end of the day, you see a car on a road and you think, but when you start to look inside these cars and you realize that, for the beginning of Tesla's history, they did a lot of first principle thinking. They did a lot of redesign for manufacturing, but they didn't go full tilt. They have, still general assembly. With Cybercab, it's like completely, like they rethought the entire process based on, like, look, we Tesla build lots of cars. We built 8 million of them or whatever. How do we rethink this process from square zero? And that's what Cybercab represents. And then therefore it leads to heavy volume output at the lowest potential cost. I mean, that's what this is all about. Ultimately, at the end of the day, it's about quality too, and safety, and a bunch of other necessary attributes. But it's going to be, I mean, this is why Waymo isn't even in the game, right? Because at scale, every time they up the scale of this thing, they could reduce the cost dramatically, but it's the design itself that puts this in the cost category that really nobody can touch. With the amount of electronics and so all the cost additives that people used to think of on EVs have mostly dissipated because of the batteries aren't those heavy cost object as much anymore. They're heavy, but not the cost department so much. And then all of a sudden, you've got all this beautiful consolidation of components, and means less moving parts. I mean, the number of moving parts in the car is extremely limited. And therefore the number of the necessary fluids is extremely, very low profile for what.
And the breakdown potential, the number of repairs required, all gets lower and lower.
So what you end up with is a car that now can go 500,000 miles.
Right.
So they junk it, right?
Yeah. All right, Phil.
All right.
As always, fascinating, and apparently it's fascinating because Elon keeps liking this stuff. So, and maybe it's even right. I mean, fascinating is one thing.
Yeah.
Being right is a whole other thing.
Yeah.
So
Well, I mean,
anyway,
I think there isn't a point to be made here. Is look,
yeah,
I don't work at Tesla.
yeah,
I'm not inside that car. I can't tell you how many, zonal bridge architecture
right,
components are. But I can tell you that the basics. We've got the macro right here,
right, right.
and that's what the magic of this vehicle is.
All right. So you should also, of course, follow Phil Beisel because, he's saying things that apparently are aligned with our fearless leader. And so follow Phil Beisel and then buy his book. Buy his book. Yeah.
Oh
There you
yeah,
go.
my
Yeah, yeah.
book, which is
Buy
your book,
Phil's,
which is
buy Phil's book.
yeah.
And with that said, I'm going to say it's been great talking to you.